The Wilderness Crucible had earned its reputation across 17 star systems as the program that separated the truly capable from the merely educated. For 3 centuries, the finest survival institutes in the galaxy had been sending their most promising students to prove themselves against nature itself, stripped of the technological crutches that modern civilization provided. The rules were delightfully simple: 30 days on a hostile world with nothing but primitive tools, no computers, no energy weapons, no fabricators, and absolutely no calling home when things got uncomfortable. The instructors had designed this iteration with what they considered perfect fairness. Every participant would receive the same basic kit: a stone knife, cordage made from plant fibers, a fire-starting rod, and a water container fashioned from dried gourd. Primitive, equal. A true test of adaptability rather than who brought the fanciest gear. The head instructor, a towering Vrelnath named Kosh, with 4 arms and an insufferable habit of clicking his mandibles when he thought he was clever, had personally selected the location, Theta Verdant, a jungle world where everything either wanted to eat you, poison you, or both. Theta Verdant did not believe in gentle introductions. The planet greeted visitors with humidity thick enough to swim through, temperatures that fluctuated wildly, and an ecosystem that had apparently attended the same school of hospitality as a woodchipper. The canopy stretched 300 feet overhead, blocking sunlight into perpetual twilight. The undergrowth was dense enough to hide a cargo freighter. Marcus Webb stood at the drop point and surveyed his surroundings with calm assessment. He was 34, lean in the way that came from actual labor rather than gym memberships, with hands that showed calluses in places that made the medical examiner at the pre-mission physical ask uncomfortable questions. His brown hair was already damp with sweat, and his grey eyes tracked movement in the undergrowth with the focus of someone who understood that nature did not care about your feelings or your survival. The other participants examined the primitive tools with expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed disgust. There was Zixthar, a Quilenthian whose species had mastered quantum computing before humans discovered agriculture, currently holding the stone knife like it might contaminate him. Beside him stood Murdoch, a Hesperan female, whose people had engineered their planet into a climate-controlled paradise, now sweating profusely and looking at the jungle like it had personally insulted her entire genetic line. Rounding out the group was Ven, a Crowlight, whose crystalline body structure meant he processed information at speeds that made computers jealous, and who was currently processing the fact that none of his natural advantages meant anything when confronted with mud, vines, and the distant screech of something that definitely had teeth. Instructor Kosh clicked his mandibles. Participants, you stand at the threshold of true survival assessment. Your species have conquered stars, bent physics to your will, and achieved wonders beyond ancient imagination. Now you will prove you can survive without any of it. You have 30 days. Build shelter, find food, purify water, survive. Marcus listened with half an ear, already identifying useful plants in his peripheral vision. That vine there had the right tensile strength for lashing. Those leaves showed water collection potential. The tree bark indicated moisture retention. Meanwhile, Zixthar was asking about the appeals process. The transport lifted off with finality, carrying the instructors back to their comfortable monitoring station, where they could watch the participants struggle while drinking sophisticated beverages. The 5 participants stood in the clearing for approximately 30 seconds before everyone scattered in different directions, because apparently even when stripped of technology, intelligent beings still preferred personal space. Marcus watched them go, then set about the business of not dying. He had perhaps 4 hours of useful daylight left, which meant shelter was priority 1, water was priority 2, and everything else could wait. He moved through the jungle with deliberate steps, reading the terrain like a book written in a language everyone else had forgotten. That depression would collect water and breed mosquitoes. That cluster of rocks would house snakes. That clearing sat at the bottom of natural drainage that would become a river when it rained. 20 minutes brought him to a spot that did not immediately scream death trap. A small rise, good drainage, protected from wind by natural rock formation, close to a water source but not so close that every predator would use him as a convenient snack. He dropped his kit and began gathering materials with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. The shelter came together with practiced ease. Marcus cut saplings with his stone knife, wove them into a frame using techniques that predated written language, then layered broad leaves in overlapping patterns that would shed water. By the time darkness fell, he had a shelter that would keep him dry, a fire burning cheerfully, and water boiling in his gourd container courtesy of hot rocks from the fire. Somewhere in the jungle, Zixthar was trying to build a shelter using pure geometry and discovering that nature had never taken a mathematics course. Murdoch had found a cave, which would have been excellent except caves came with previous tenants. Ven was standing perfectly still, having calculated that movement increased danger, which was technically true, but also meant he was standing in the same spot he had been 4 hours ago. Marcus ate a meal of edible tubers he had identified and tested, then settled in for the night with his fire carefully maintained and his stone knife close at hand. The jungle sang its evening chorus of things hunting other things. Morning arrived with typical jungle subtlety. Marcus woke before sunrise, added fuel to his fire, and began the day's tasks. First priority, expand water collection. Second priority, set snares for protein. Third priority, improve shelter. Fourth priority, scout surrounding area. He spent the early morning weaving a water collection system from broad leaves, creating funnels that would catch rain and morning dew, channeling it into multiple containers. The vines here were remarkably cooperative once you understood which ones would hold weight and which ones would embrace their true calling as gravity's accomplice. By mid-morning, he had doubled his water capacity and created a passive collection system. The snares came next, and this was where Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Earth had taught its children one valuable lesson. Everything that walked, crawled, or hopped followed patterns, and patterns could be exploited. He identified game trails through broken vegetation and disturbed ground. The snares were simple constructions using bent saplings for tension, cordage creating nooses, triggers set with delicate precision. Meanwhile, diverging strategies were being employed elsewhere with varying levels of success, which was a polite way of saying some people were doing better than others. Zixthar had spent the night in what he called a logical shelter design, and what objective reality called a pile of sticks that fell over twice. He was currently attempting to start a fire by thinking very hard about combustion while holding 2 rocks that were definitely not flint. Murdoch had abandoned the cave after its previous tenant made its opinions clear. She was now attempting to build a shelter using vines as if they were structural steel, discovering that natural materials had properties that did not care about expectations. Ven had moved, which was progress. He was now attempting to execute a construction plan that required tools he did not have, materials he could not identify, and skills he had never developed. Back at Marcus's camp, the human was treating firemaking like a casual Tuesday afternoon project. He had identified multiple methods, had backup materials for his backup materials, and created a fire lay that would ignite quickly, burn efficiently, and produce minimal smoke because attracting every predator seemed counterproductive. By day 3, Marcus's camp had evolved from survival shelter into actual habitation. The original shelter had been expanded with a covered area for fire, a sleeping platform elevated off the ground, and a separate structure for food storage that kept supplies dry and away from various creatures who considered his camp an interesting new buffet option. The snares had proven successful beyond expectation. Two rabbit-like creatures had found themselves involuntary guests at breakfast, contributing significantly to protein requirements. Marcus had cleaned, dressed, and prepared the meat with practiced efficiency, using every part because waste was disrespectful. The hides were stretched and drying, the bones set aside for tool making, the sinew saved for cordage. He had expanded his trap network, setting snares at various locations around his territory, each positioned with careful consideration of animal behavior and terrain. Some were simple noose snares for small game. Others were more elaborate constructions involving counterweights and trigger mechanisms. One particularly clever design used a bent sapling and figure-4 trigger to create a trap that could handle larger prey. The vine weaving had become almost meditative. Marcus created cordage during downtime, his hands moving through familiar motions. Strong cordage, weak cordage, waterproof, flexible, each type requiring different techniques and source materials. He was building a supply that would last the entire 30 days and probably the next 3 months. At the monitoring station, Instructor Kosh was clicking his mandibles in a way that suggested concern rather than smugness. The footage from Marcus's camp showed a level of competence that was statistically improbable given the primitive tools constraint. The human had not just survived 3 days, he had thrived. His camp showed organization, planning, and skills that did not appear in any standard curriculum. The other participants were having different experiences. Zixtar had achieved fire on day 2 through sheer stubborn repetition and was now attempting to cook something that he thought was edible but was actually mildly toxic. Murdoch had created a shelter that only leaked in 3 places, which she considered victory. Then had calculated himself into a corner, literally. Marcus, unaware of the drama elsewhere, was smoking meat over a slow fire, creating preserved food that would last days. The smoking rack was a simple construction of green wood, positioned at the right height to maximize smoke exposure while minimizing heat. Below, a carefully managed fire produced steady smoke from wood he had selected for flavor and burning properties. By day 4, Marcus's camp would not have been out of place in a long-term wilderness settlement. The sleeping platform now included a mattress of dried grasses and leaves contained in a woven mat that provided insulation and comfort significantly beyond rocks and dirt. The fire pit had evolved into a proper hearth, with stone backing that reflected heat into the shelter, a cooking surface of flat rocks, and a separate area for maintaining coals. The trap network had expanded to 12 separate snares at various distances from camp, checked morning and evening. The success rate was approximately 60%, which meant protein was no longer a concern, but a resource requiring management. Marcus had created a proper smoking operation, with multiple racks preserving meat in quantities that suggested long-term planning rather than a 30-day survival test. He had also identified and tested 17 different edible plants, created a small garden area, encouraging useful species to grow closer to camp, and mapped the surrounding territory in his mind with impressive detail. Water collection had become almost passive. Morning dew, rain capture, and a small spring he had located and improved with basic filtration provided more water than one human could reasonably use. He had created multiple containers from bark, gourds, and woven plant fibers, sealed with pine resin, each serving different purposes. On day 5, the first of the other participants stumbled into his territory. Murdoch appeared at the clearing's edge, looking like someone who had fought the jungle and lost every round. Her clothing was torn, her supplies were depleted, and her expression suggested someone reassessing previously held beliefs about the relationship between intelligence and survival. She stopped at the clearing's edge, staring at the camp with disbelief usually reserved for discovering physics had been lying. Marcus looked up from the fish trap he was constructing. "You look like you could use some water," he said, gesturing to one of the containers near the fire. Murdoch approached carefully, as if expecting the camp to be a hallucination. She drank deeply, then looked around with increasing incredulity. How she managed, the single word containing approximately 15 sub-questions. "Practice," Marcus replied, returning to his fish trap. "Spent a lot of time in wild places. You learn things." He did not mention that meant essentially his entire life, or that wild places included regions of Earth that made this jungle look hospitable. The monitoring station was experiencing what instructor Kosh would later describe as significant recalibration of expectations. The footage from Marcus's camp showed primitive technology development that was supposed to take weeks, not days. The human had not just survived, he had established dominance over his environment, using nothing but knowledge, skill, and apparently a complete disregard for the difficulty level everyone else was experiencing. Zixthar arrived 6 hours after Murdoch, having followed her trail with desperation. Ven appeared the following morning, his crystalline structure looking somehow duller. They stood at the camp's edge, staring at the smoking racks, the organized storage, the comfortable shelter, and the human currently teaching Murdoch how to properly construct a debris hut. "This is supposed to be primitive," Zixthar said, though his tone suggested he was no longer certain what primitive actually meant. Marcus glanced up from his instruction. "This is primitive. No power sources, no manufactured materials, no advanced tools, just what the planet provides and knowledge about how to use it." He returned to demonstrating a lashing technique that had been old when the pyramids were new. The galaxy called this primitive, Earth called this Tuesday. The monitoring station had gone from confident observation to emergency meeting faster than a ship jumping to hyperspace. Instructor Kosh stood before the display screens, showing Marcus's camp, his mandibles clicking in a rhythm that suggested agitation rather than smugness. The other instructors watched the footage with expressions ranging from confusion to something approaching existential crisis. "He has established a base camp that rivals our monitoring station for comfort," observed Instructor Yenna, a Kaldorian, whose species prided themselves on efficiency. Using nothing but plant materials, stone tools, and apparently spite. Kosh reviewed the participant file again, as if reading it more carefully would reveal some missed detail. His species was evaluated as technologically dependent. Earth required significant technological advancement to achieve spaceflight. Their development suggested limited primitive survival capacity. He paused. The assessment appears to have been incomplete. Back in the jungle, Marcus's camp had become something between a survival school and a refugee center. The 3 alien participants were learning the basics of wilderness survival, as practiced by a species that had spent most of its history perfecting the art of not dying in places that wanted them dead. Murdoch was proving an apt student, her engineering mindset translating well once she stopped trying to apply it to materials that did not care about her calculations. "Why can you do this?" Murdoch asked during an evening meal of smoked meat, roasted tubers, and something resembling tea made from local plants Marcus had identified as safe. "Your species has technology. You have spacecraft, computers, advanced medicine. Why maintain these primitive skills?" Marcus poked the fire, sending sparks spiraling into darkness. "Because technology fails. Equipment breaks, computers crash, spacecraft malfunction. When that happens, you need something that doesn't depend on power sources or replacement parts. He gestured at the camp. This is the foundation everything else builds on. The galaxy forgot that. Earth remembered, because we had to. Had to? Zixthar asked, finally showing interest beyond his own discomfort. Earth is not a friendly planet, Marcus explained. We evolved in a place that had predators, parasites, poisonous plants, extreme weather, natural disasters, and approximately 17 different ways to die from simple dehydration. Humans survived by learning, adapting, and passing knowledge to the next generation. When we developed technology, we didn't abandon the old knowledge. We couldn't afford to. Venn processed this information with visible concentration. Your species maintained parallel knowledge systems. Technological advancement concurrent with primitive skill retention. We called it camping, Marcus said with a slight smile. Or hunting. Or hiking. Recreation that was actually survival training in disguise. Millions of humans maintained these skills not because they needed them daily, but because they might need them eventually. He looked at the three aliens. You built civilizations that eliminated the need for primitive survival. We built civilizations on top of primitive survival. Different approaches. The confrontation came the following morning, when Instructor Kosh arrived at the camp personally. He stood at the clearing's edge, his forearms hanging in a posture that suggested someone reassessing previously held certainties, and surveyed the camp. This was supposed to be an equal assessment, he said finally. Primitive tools only. Level playing field. Fair measurement of adaptability. Marcus looked up from the basket he was weaving. It was fair. We all got the same tools and the same environment. Not my fault. The galaxy confused primitive with useless and technological with capable. Your species retained knowledge our civilizations abandoned millennia ago, Kosh observed, moving closer to examine the camp structure. We assumed primitive meant lesser. Apparently primitive meant foundational. Apparently, Marcus agreed, returning to his basket weaving with casual competence that made advanced degrees feel inadequate. The Wilderness Crucible program concluded on day 30 with Marcus Webb's comfortable extraction from a camp that had, by the final week, included a proper latrine system, rain catchment capable of supplying a small village, and a smoking operation that had preserved enough meat to feed all participants for the remaining duration. The other participants had survived, mostly though their extraction required more medical attention and psychological counseling about confronting personal limitations and species-level hubris. The program results were analyzed, reviewed, and analyzed again because surely something had been missed. Marcus Webb had not just passed the Wilderness Crucible. He had dominated it with casualness that suggested the jungle had been mildly challenging at best. His camp had demonstrated sustainable resource management, long-term planning, and skill execution that exceeded instructor capabilities despite their species' technological advancement. Instructor Kosh submitted his final report with mandibles clicking in embarrassment mixed with professional respect. The report concluded that humans possessed parallel knowledge systems maintaining primitive survival skills concurrent with technological advancement, that Earth's hostile environment had created selective pressure favoring knowledge retention across generations, and that perhaps the galaxy had been slightly premature in assuming technological species had evolved beyond the need for foundational survival capabilities. The training program was revised. The assessment criteria were updated. The definition of primitive was reconsidered to mean foundational rather than obsolete. And somewhere in the new guidelines was a note, added by Kosh himself, that read, "Never assume a species that survived to develop technology did so by accident. Investigate how they survived first." Marcus returned to Earth with compensation, credentials and a standing invitation to instruct at the Wilderness Crucible program, which he declined because teaching aliens how to weave baskets sounded exhausting, and he had a cabin in Montana that required maintenance. He did accept an ongoing consultation position, advising on program design from the comfort of places with significantly less humidity. The galaxy learned several lessons from what became known as the Webb incident. The primary lesson was simple: never confuse the tools a species uses with the knowledge they possess. Technology is what you build. Survival is what you know. And humans apparently knew quite a bit about both. The Wilderness Crucible continued accepting participants, training the best and brightest in survival skills across various hostile environments. But now, before each program began, instructors showed footage of Marcus Webb's camp and asked one simple question: can you do this? Most participants realized the honest answer was no. Some learned anyway. Others returned to their comfortable technological civilizations with new appreciation for the foundations their species had abandoned. And in a cabin in Montana, Marcus Webb maintained skills his ancestors had developed, improved his techniques through experimentation, and occasionally checked communication requests from various galactic organizations wanting to hire the human who had proven that primitive was not an insult but a compliment. He declined most offers, accepted a few, and continued living in a way that would have made perfect sense to his ancestors, and apparently made no sense whatsoever to species who had forgotten that before you could reach the stars, you first had to survive the ground. The galaxy had called it primitive, Earth had called it survival. In the end, both definitions were correct, and the galaxy had simply forgotten that surviving was the first prerequisite for everything else. Technology built civilizations. Survival built the people who built technology. And humans somehow had remembered to keep both. The trainers had said primitive only, expecting equality through limitation. Instead, they discovered that primitive was not a limitation but a foundation, and some species had never stopped building on that foundation even as they reached for stars. It was ironic, educational, and slightly embarrassing for everyone involved except Marcus, who had simply demonstrated what humans had been doing for millennia, surviving in places that would prefer they did not, using tools that did not require batteries, and maintaining knowledge that technology could not replace.